verse 31, and we're going to go into chapter 47, verse 12. We only have this Sunday and then 2 more Sundays, and we're done with Genesis. And then we start a series, a 6-week series called 6 Strategies. These are 6 strategies, things that you can do to take your life from ordinary to extraordinary. And I think it's going to be a real challenging study, and I would encourage you to invite friends to come to this. And if you have co-workers, this would be, some of these principles are just, I mean, they're the kind of things that you can apply in your work, at home. These are very, very life-changing principles. It's called, and it begins the first Sunday in February, so I hope you'll join us for that. Okay, so we are in Genesis chapter 46, and we're taking a look, we're wrapping things up with our study in Genesis. And to kind of bring you up to speed on the story, Joseph is the prime minister of Egypt, essentially. And as you know the story, he'd been sold into slavery by his brothers, and now, through a series of events, they have to go to Egypt for food because there's famine in the land, and they they come to find out that Joseph is their brother, that long-lost brother that they thought was dead. And so there's this whole series of discovery. Hey, there's Mike. How are you, brother? We've been praying for you. We had a little scare with Mike. Mike went to the hospital earlier and had some blockage and thought maybe some cancer might have reoccurred, but everything is good. God is good. Good to see you, Mike. And so in this study, we begin to see how God works things out in a way that just are mind-boggling sometimes. He does things in a way that can only be attributed to God. And so now Joseph has gotten them to go back and bring his father to him and bring them all to Egypt for the famine. They're only 2 years into this famine. This famine is going to last 7 years. And so he says, come back, bring the whole family, bring the goods, bring the sheep, bring everything, and come back and live in this area. So we pick it up with Genesis chapter 46, beginning with verse 31. Then Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I will go up and speak to Pharaoh, and I will say to him, my brothers and my father's household who were living in the land of Canaan have come to me. The men are shepherds. They tend livestock, and they have brought along their flocks and herds and everything they own. When Pharaoh calls you in and asks, what is your occupation? You should answer, your servants have tended livestock from our boyhood on, just as our fathers did. Then you will be allowed to settle in the region of Goshen, for all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians. Joseph went and told Pharaoh, my father and brothers with their flocks and herds and everything they own have come from the land of Canaan and are now in Goshen. He chose 5 of his brothers and presented them before Pharaoh. I find that interesting, that just with that one little statement. He just picked 5 of them. He didn't take the whole gang in. You know, there's 11 of them. You know, so he just picks 5 of them and says, no, just a few. We don't want to overwhelm him. Pharaoh asked the brothers, what's your occupation? Your servants are shepherds, they replied to Pharaoh, just as our fathers were. They also said to him, we've come to live here for a while because the famine is severe in Canaan and your servants' flocks have no pasture. So now please let your servants settle in Goshen. Pharaoh said to Joseph, your father and your brothers have come to you, and the land of Egypt is before you. Settle your father and your brothers in the best part of the land. Let them live in Goshen, and if you know of any among them with special ability, put them in charge of my own livestock. Then Joseph brought his father Jacob in and presented him before Pharaoh. After Jacob blessed Pharaoh, Pharaoh asked him, how old are you? And Jacob said to Pharaoh, the years of my pilgrimage are 130. My years have been few and difficult. Actually, 130 was fairly young, you know, in those days. So he wasn't really an old man, but he was beat up. He'd gone through some difficult times. My years have been few and difficult, and they do not equal the years of the pilgrimage of my fathers. Then Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from his presence. So Joseph settled his father and his brothers in Egypt and gave them property in the best part of the land, the district of Ramses. I always mess it up. I always want to say Ramses, and it's Ramses. Actually, is the correct way to say it. As Pharaoh, the district of Ramses, as Pharaoh directed. Joseph also provided his father and his brothers with all of his father's household with food according to the number of their children. Now, I want us to take a look at, I want to kind of give you some background, and then I have some principles that I hope will be of real benefit to you. Egyptian shepherds and feeders of cattle. Now I'm talking about Egyptian shepherds and feeders of cattle. And they usually lump shepherds as caretakers of sheep and cattle together. So these Egyptian shepherds and feeders of cattle were usually lawless, free-wheeling bandits that would make inroads into the villages, and they would rob, and they were like what we would tend to think of just gypsies that would just go around and steal things and then move on. They were kind of had that kind of reputation. And they would steal cattle, and they would steal whatever spoils they could find. However, the Hebrew shepherds were considered even more disgusting because Hebrews sacrificed sheep and cattle. And so to the Egyptians, that was really, really disgusting, that you would raise these things and then you would sacrifice them. And the Egyptians considered, particularly the ox and the sheep, they considered them to be sacred. And so in that day, Egypt was really kind of separated from the rest of the world. And it was separated primarily socially. And one of the reasons was because Egyptian dietary laws of that time were very strict about food preparation. And while they did eat sheep and cattle, there were rules on how the meat was to be prepared. And, we look at Jewish dietary laws, and we say, well, it has to be kosher, and there's so many laws and everything. But their laws were no more complicated than the laws of the Egyptians. In fact, the Egyptians' laws may have been even more complicated. One historian noted that Egyptians would not use a knife from a different country because it might have been used to cut the flesh of some of those animals which they held sacred. That's how intense they were about their dietary laws and rules and regulations. There's a Roman historian by the name of Tacitus, and speaking of the Jews, this is what he said. They sacrificed the ram in order to insult Jupiter Ammon, and they sacrificed the ox, which the Egyptians worshiped under the name Apis. So this was very detestable to them. They saw what the Jews were doing, and they considered that really, really disgusting. And so the shepherds were even more disgusting than the Egyptian shepherds because of that. So Pharaoh, while he was grateful to Joseph for his brilliant management of the country through this devastating famine, was not really wanting to integrate Joseph's family into the Egyptian culture. But he does something that is remarkably generous. He sends them to this district of Ramses in the area of Goshen. Now here's a map of where Goshen is. You can see the red arrow there. That's generally the area of Goshen. Now just to the right there, you see the Sinai Peninsula. So just that little area, just to the left of the Sinai Peninsula, and just on the north end of Egypt is considered Goshen. Now, let me give you a close-up of that area, specifically where Ramses is. The district of Ramses was right in the Nile Delta, right in the middle of it, essentially. And it was a beautiful, fertile area. And it was perfect for raising sheep and cattle. And in fact, it was so perfect that that's where Pharaoh kept his livestock. And that was no small group of livestock, believe me. It was basically a government type of operation. So not a bad deal for a bunch of guys whose job was to raise a bunch of stinky sheep. And so now they're given this job to go to the best part of the country. They can bring their own sheep and raise their sheep. They're given this land to use. And not only that, but Pharaoh asks Joseph to determine if there was one who would have a special ability to care for sheep, to oversee Pharaoh's livestock. Well, who might that be? Let me take you to a verse that we studied earlier in the life of Jacob. After Jacob was tricked into taking Leah as his wife and then eventually getting Rachel as his wife, and he worked for his father-in-law, Laban, for 14 years, Laban agreed to let Jacob have the most undesirable throwaway sheep. Those were the spotted sheep. They wanted pure white sheep, but there were sheep that had spots on them, and so he says, you can have those. We don't want those. Those are disgusting sheep. And one of the reasons was because they couldn't use the spotted sheep for sacrifices. But he said, I'll take the white sheep, you can have all the rest. And in Genesis 30, we discover what a genius of a rancher that Jacob was. talks about how he got the sheep to mate and grow his flock. And chapter 30 concludes with this statement, Genesis 30, verse 43. In this way, the man, that's talking about Jacob, grew exceedingly prosperous and came to own large flocks and female and male servants and camels and donkeys. He was a genius at this. He knew how to take care of animals. Animal husbandry came naturally to him. So I suspect that Joseph knew exactly to whom to entrust Pharaoh's livestock. Not that Jacob would be able to do the work himself, but that he could oversee his sons doing the work, and they could get paid handsomely for it. So this was a pretty good deal. It's amazing how God does this thing. So now they not only move to Egypt, they get to live in this district of Ramses, which is the best area in Egypt, the most fertile. They get to bring their own livestock. Now they're given charge over Pharaoh's livestock. They get paid for it, and they have this perfect setup. It's amazing.